Hi, good morning. My name is Bruce Stokes, and I'll be the moderator for our discussion today on foreign policy and the 2016 primaries. I want to welcome all of you intrepid people who have braved the threat of the storm today to make it out here. And also, I think I'm looking forward to our conversation about the storm of our primaries and what they all mean to us, because in a couple of weeks we're going to be in the midst of it all. And one of the real questions, I think, is whether this will be one of those rare instances where this is a foreign policy election or an election that's driven in large part by foreign policy rather than domestic issues. We have a number of experts with us today, old friends. Charlie Cook, the editor and publisher of the Cook Political Report, former colleague of mine at the National Journal for many years. Sam Feist, who's the Washington Bureau Chief and Senior VP of CNN, who can entertain us with stories about organizing debates and how foreign policy can take over debates. That's true. And Jim Lindsay, the Senior VP of the CFR, Director of Studies, and the Maurice Greenberg Chair here at the Council, and a longtime partner with Pew on a number of surveys of CFR members. We're going to have an initial period where I lead a conversation up here, but we will have ample time for you folks to ask your questions and make comments. I will get you out of here at 9:30 as promised. I would remind you this is on the record. We are simulcast or live casting this, so this is not a typical CFR event where it's on what we used to call Chatham House rules and now are CFR rules, I guess.
Thank you.
But let me start it off by asking Charlie Cook. The Pew Research Center's survey in December found that for the first time in years, national security rather than the domestic economy was the leading concern of the public. Now, this was in the wake of Paris, in the wake of San Bernardino, and specifically terrorism was the issue that people were most concerned about. Now, Gallup came out with a survey in January that said concern about terrorism was down a bit. Economy was back up as the number one issue. So I guess my leadoff question to you is, do you anticipate that this will be an American election where foreign policy plays, if not the most important role, at least a disproportionate role, or will it be still domestic issues that drive the electorate?
First, the answer is no. I don't think this is going to be a foreign policy-driven election unless something event in the 60 days or so leading into the election. But what I first want to throw in, Richard Haass has asked us to announce that anybody that's here this morning gets a 25% discount on their CFR dues for next year because you're so intrepid about coming here. Americans rarely vote on foreign policy issues, and it has to be a dramatic and immediate event happening leading into the election. And so I have no doubt, San Bernardino certainly did spike it up. But I think, and we can get into this more different, but I think the mindset, John Edwards used to say that we had two countries, the have and the have-nots. And for me, there's a democratic country and an independent country and a Republican country. And Republican attitudes towards foreign policy is near apoplectic, existential threat to our country. Things are on the edge. We're about to go into the abyss. And Democrats, well, this is a somewhat elevated concern. And independents, in the middle, but a little bit closer to Democrats. But it really depends on who you're talking to, how big a role it's going to play.
Well, jump in here.
Although during the primaries, we just did a poll in New Hampshire that came out this week. And Hillary does best on foreign policy, Hillary Clinton over Bernie Sanders, yet foreign policy among Democrats is way down. Yeah. And just the opposite on the Republican side. Foreign policy is the number one issue for Republicans. They say it is, at least in New Hampshire, and I think elsewhere as well. And Donald Trump does very well. So in the primaries, it's certainly, to your point, Republicans are making foreign policy an important issue, and it's playing out that way, which I think is giving Donald Trump more things to talk about, that some of the establishment Republicans have less to say, and is giving him an advantage in the primaries right now.
Well, let's pursue this for a minute.
Which is ironic, and we ought to just sort of savor this for a second.
Yeah. Well, the surveys show, our CNN's, others show that there's a real partisan split on foreign policy issues, that Republicans are more concerned about China than Democrats. Republicans are more concerned about terrorism and the war on terror, don't think it's working, than Democrats. Republicans are more supportive of sending troops to the Middle East than Democrats. As a Chinese friend of mine quipped recently, his assessment of the Republican candidates was that they believed in omnidirectional bellicosity. Now, the question is, omnidirectional bellicosity only works if it resonates with the electorate. Why do you think that Republicans seem to be more afraid, and in response to this, more willing to use force than Democrats?
So I think it could be a couple of things happening at the same time. As you headed out of 2015 and into 2016, put aside the little blip in the stock market, the economy was generally doing better. And if you're a Republican looking for issues that you might be able to use against Democrats, perhaps foreign policy might be more effective, particularly if over the course of the next 11, 12 months, the economy does recover. Unemployment was hitting recent lows as we ended 2015. So that's a part of it in terms of tactics of the candidates, I think. But it also resonates with Republicans, and Trump's message from the beginning is clearly playing on concern and fears among base Republican voters that have been exacerbated by Paris, exacerbated by San Bernardino, and he's taking advantage of those of that concern and that fear, and it's working.
But it's also worth pointing out that Republicans traditionally worry more about foreign policy, defense, national security issues than Democrats. So what Charlie pointed to, sort of this very strong partisan difference between Democrats and Republicans, and also independents sort of fall in the middle on which issues are important and how important they are, existed before 2016. Right. I don't think we should lose sight of that. In many ways, I agree with sort of Charlie's opening point about this not being a foreign policy election in all likelihood. I mean, there are rhythms in American politics, and we're seeing them play out here.
Well,
although foreign policy is the unpredictability is something that who knows what's going to happen in the world in August, September, and October of 2016. We, as we ended 2015, we were planning a debate that we had in Las Vegas in the middle of December. And as we had started to plan that debate, it was going to be a debate that covered a whole range of topics: domestic, maybe some social issues, foreign policy, terrorism. That debate came about a week and a half after San Bernardino, a couple of weeks after the recent Paris, the second Paris attack, and of course it became 100% a commander-in-chief debate. That is the only subject we did because that's what the news events dictated.
Yeah, but it's important to keep in mind the fact that something matters to the voters doesn't mean it matters to the vote. I mean, what you sort of have to focus on, to what extent, if we talk about foreign policy, is it, in the case of the primaries, differentiating among candidates? And I would argue in the case of Republican primaries, since the Republicans are hitting the same basic theme, Obama is too weak, we must be strong, reassert American leadership, I don't see it differentiating among the Republican candidates. But just Charlie, I mean, the other question is, will it change turnout? Are more people going to come to the vote, or different people coming to the ballot box because of foreign policy? I don't see any evidence that's true. And the final thing is to keep in mind is that most people already know who they're going to vote for. They may not know it, but they do. We look at all of our social science research, which indicates that people who tend to vote Democrat generally tend to vote Democrat. Those who lean Republican vote Republican. And indeed, sort of the movable middle has over the years shrunk in size. If you go back to the 60s, perhaps 15% of voters in a presidential election from cycle to cycle may switch. Now it's down maybe 5%, 7%. So the number of people who are open to being moved is actually a lot smaller. I don't think we should lose sight of that in this conversation.
That's, I think, a very good point, is that if you look at the overall self-identification numbers, we've never had more people who self-identify as independents. But at least in our work, and I would assume CNN has found the same thing, that if you look at leaners to the Republican Party, leaners to the Democratic Party, actually, we aren't that, divided. We're divided, but there's no, the middle is not nearly as big.
Well,
In
and a
fact,
lot
it's
of those
very
Tea
small.
Partiers, for example, they call themselves independents because they don't want to be associated
Right.
with an official political party.
they'll vote.
But we know that they're Republicans.
There are people that have some deep-seated psychological need to call themselves independents. Functionally speaking, they're partisans.
Yes.
And so they vote, an independent who leans Democrat votes virtually as Democratic as a real Democrat. The same thing for a lean Republican. But to a point Jim made a couple minutes ago, I'm sure Chris Matthews would not want to say this now that his wife's running for Congress. But Chris used to say, with predictable overstatement, we have two parties in this country. We have a mommy party and a daddy party. And the mommy party is a caring, nurturing party that's concerned about education and daycare and, touchy-feely stuff. And the daddy party is tough on defense, tough on crime, et cetera, et cetera. Now, obviously, it's a gross exaggeration, plus very sexist. But the thing is, there's some underlying truth there, is that there are themes in each party that are very, very real. So it is perfectly natural for Republicans to want to sort of rattle cages a little bit more on the Republican side, or on the defense side. But I think the other thing, though, is that there is now a view among conservatives and most Republicans that anything that President Obama touches or thought about touching is evil, wrong, destructive, dangerous. And even if he hadn't thought of it yet, if he did, then that would be evil. And again, it's this apocalyptic existential threat thing that's over there that I think sometimes, and I don't want to be an apologist for President Obama because I think he's been a fairly mediocre president, but the thing is that I think sometimes in politics, if you hate someone so much, it really colors your judgment on a lot of things. And I think that they're totally, totally blinded by their hatred for him. Therefore, they're not necessarily making a lot of really objective judgments on
do you
it.
Although
think that-
their dislike for Hillary Clinton is not wholly different than their dislike for Barack Obama.
It's close. It's close. Yeah.
But do you think that because Obama is president, and this has been Obama's foreign policy for the last 7 years, that to the extent that foreign policy is an issue in this election, it's really a referendum on Obama's handling of foreign policy. Then it gets back to Charlie's point about it's a referendum on Obama. We know in our surveys that for years now people have said he's not tough enough, but it's Republicans who say he's overwhelmingly who say he's not tough enough. Actually, Democrats think he's doing a fine, tough job. But this question of the need to have a tough president, the perception of a president being tough, does it appeal to an authoritarian strain among some voters? I mean, there's some debate here about what Trump's appeal is. It is to authoritarianism. What does this say about the voters?
Well, and let me ask a question of these guys. Is the question, approve, disapprove President Obama's job on foreign policy, it's almost a real question of how do you think things are going on in the world?
Yeah.
And if things aren't going on, if they feel uneasy about what's going on in the world, then it's thumbs down, notwithstanding the feelings that conservatives have and Republicans have towards him.
But the issue of strong leader, that question we've been asking for forever, matters. And it's mattered in election after election. Americans tend to elect the person they see as the stronger of the two general election candidates. Not always, but almost always. And I think that this is one of those years where that matters. Foreign policy is a big part of it. Sometimes strong leader is because can this person guide the U.S. economy and get us out of a ditch if that's what's necessary. But the notion of picking the candidate of the two who is the stronger leader is not new and plays out almost every time.
Let's back up for 1 minute here. I want to ask Jim, we're debating whether foreign policy is going to be the lead issue in this election. When was the last time that foreign policy played a major role in a presidential election as we kind of think back about the outcome of past presidential elections?
Well, I would say that the notion of a foreign policy election is sort of the white whale of American politics. It's much commented upon, but very seldom cited. I mean, you sort of go back, throw out candidates, 1968, Humphrey versus Nixon, but when you actually look at sort of the policy positions of both men, they weren't that far apart. So it wasn't necessarily that a particular position on that issue separated them. And there were plenty of other issues going on at the country time. I mean, think of George Wallace and his popularity. It wasn't tied to the Vietnam War. 1980 with Ronald Reagan. You can talk about the hostages, but I would also remind everybody there was something called the misery index, in the sense that the economy was not doing very well, interest rates in double digits. So it's very hard to sort of say that was an election that clearly turned on foreign policy. I do think you can see in primaries where foreign policy can matter, and go back to 2008 with Barack Obama and Secretary Clinton, or then Senator Clinton, in which I think for Senator Clinton, certainly at the beginning, her position on Iraq, the fact that she had voted for it and was unwilling, at least at that point, to apologize or repudiate her vote, unlike several of the other people in the primary challenge at that time, I think did give Barack Obama an opening. Now, was that really a foreign policy issue, or it was a question sort of what Democrats viewed as a major mistake that she didn't want to walk away from?
Bernie Sanders is taking advantage of that same issue
Yeah.
this time. It's one of the few areas where Hillary Clinton is out of step with her party, and she's acknowledged that it was a mistake, that the war was a mistake, on and on. But he has used that issue.
It is amazing that, what is that, 8, now maybe 14 years ago that
Right.
that vote took place? And it's still thrown up as this is a bad judgment.
It's thrown up, but it's not clear how effective it is, because
Yeah,
what's
yeah.
very interesting, like the issue that would have potentially distinguished between Secretary Clinton and Senator Sanders would have been TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And very early on in the campaign, Secretary Clinton took it off the table by saying, while I have been in favor of free trade, in favor of TPP, this one didn't meet my standards. And that essentially neutralized that issue that could have divided or separated the two candidates.
And the Iraq war vote could also have been a bigger issue for Democrats if foreign policy was a bigger concern among Democrats. But because it's so low, it's not at the heart of the conversation.
But I think for most Democrats don't consider trade to be foreign policy.
No,
They think
that's correct.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
about jobs
Yeah.
and the economy.
But let's face it, anything other than income, wealth, inequality, or free college tuition, Bernie Sanders really doesn't want to talk about.
Yeah.
And he's not comfortable talking about it. And I think that's one thing that's going to sort of keep this from getting too elevated on the Democratic side, is that's, he's pretty much on message and uncomfortable getting off message.
But also keep in mind, on foreign policy, they're not in violent disagreement. They agree in large part. They're comfortable with essentially President Obama's foreign policy. There's a lot of reason not to come out and say that. And I do think, getting back to your point, Bruce, when you get to a general election, Republicans clearly will try to turn this into a foreign policy election, make it a referendum on President Obama's handling of foreign policy, and whoever the Democratic candidate is going to have to deal with that issue, and presumably we'll try to turn it away from a referendum on President Obama, talking about specific policies, and if we've seen this movie play out before, arguing that the Republican candidates' ideas are risky or not well thought out.
Well, let me ask you one question where you do see economic policy and foreign policy overlap, and that's dealing with China. Because at least our surveys show that when you ask people about their concerns about China, it's the economy, maybe cybersecurity. It's not military threats by China per se. But that people see, in that CFR Pew survey we did, that among foreign policy concerns, people name protecting American jobs as a foreign policy concern. So even though it's technically not, they conflate the two, especially when it has to do with China. So I guess the question is, we've seen a little bit of China bashing in the Republican primary. I mean, Trump is, despite the fact that he denies it, it's on tape that he called for a 45% tariff on imports from China, which I think outdoes Dick Gephardt back in the 80s. And for those of you who remember that.
And Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton by a mile.
Right, exactly. And but it's reminiscent of a little bit of China bashing that took place between Clinton and Obama in the primaries that then disappeared once Obama became president. But it's also reminiscent of the China bashing in the 80s in the Democratic primaries especially. Do we think this has any traction in the election, or is it kind of just noise and it'll go away?
I say it has no traction. And indeed, we're talking here about, is 2016 going to be a foreign policy election? Right. I actually don't think the conversation right now is about foreign policy. It's about terrorism. Mm-hmm. And indeed,
that's exactly right.
All of the other issues, whether we're talking about China, we're talking about Russia, we're talking about North Korea, if you want to go to climate change or Burundi, have largely fallen by the wayside. Candidates aren't engaging in them. And it's really, again, if you look at the public opinion polls, when you ask people, what is the most important issue facing the country? They say terrorism. They're not saying China. They're not saying Russian aggression. They're not saying the future of Europe. So I think we have to be careful we don't sort of overgeneralize, because there's one issue that's getting a lot of airtime that the public is seized with what we should do about North Korea. In fact, they're not. And indeed, if you watch this campaign, it's in some sense not different from most campaigns. They're very long on criticism. Mm-hmm. And if you're in the outside party, it's criticism of the terrible job the incumbent has done. Very short on prescription. Indeed, candidates tend not to get into that. Sometimes that's a benefit, because oftentimes candidates can make promises that come back to haunt them when they succeed in being president. But in large part because a lot of these issues don't have really great policy solutions, and probably the classic cases with ISIS, where there's a lot of pounding the table about who's going to be stronger in dealing with ISIS, but in terms of particular suggestions about what they would do differently, it doesn't look that different than current policy. It may not be in the same zip code as President Obama's policy, but it's in the same area code. So that leads you to sort of, in essence, argue, as I think some of the Republican candidates have, an attitude will solve it.
At least the tonality of the Republican criticism is very harsh, especially by Ted Cruz and others. The question is there any hint there, based on experience in past elections, that people are painting themselves into corners, or is there no corner you can really paint yourself into as a candidate? You can get out of it by just ignoring it once you're a president.
I don't know. I think Republicans have been painting themselves into corners on lots of things this year. I mean, to me, I always look, I mentioned earlier, Democratic America, Independent America, Republican America. And I always look and say, okay, for independents on any given issue, do they seem to look more like the way Democrats think or more like Republicans think? And I think more often than any time I can remember, independents, they're not over as far as Democrats are, but they generally are closer to where Democrats are than Republicans are, and that's politically painting yourself into a corner.
Yeah. Except that if you believe that Donald Trump's success so far is because the people who are supporting him are scared. They're scared about terrorist attacks here in the United States. They're worried about their jobs. They're worried about people taking their jobs. They're worried about having their job 5 or 10 years from now. They're worried about whether their kids are going to have as good a life as they have had. His supporters, I think, fall into the category of concerned about all of those things. He is speaking directly to them, and I don't know that he's painting himself into a corner with this group of people, some of whom veer into the Reagan Democrat category. And he's having success with those messages.
Yeah, no, I'm saying more Republican/conservatives. I mean, Trump is, to me, he's more populist.
Very populist.
I mean, he's closer to the right than to the left, generally, but it's really more populist than anything else, and more anger, and, there's not a lot of ideological cohesion with what Donald Trump actually believes, or what he said over his lifetime.
I would think if you're a presidential candidate, painting yourself into a corner is actually a good problem to have, because that means you've won the election and you can deal with the problems down the road. And I think one of the things that happen when you have a conversation is really a lot of table pounding. It's really sort of about attitude. If I'm in office, these good things are going to happen, is that you don't paint yourself in the corner because you haven't committed yourself to a certain set number of acts that you're going to have to then walk back. I mean, think classic case would be Bill Clinton's opposition to NAFTA in China Most Favored Nation status back in '92, and then sort of having to find a way to sort of walk back from that. So, and that's an example of that. Even if you paint yourself in a corner, just to create a whole new room for yourself. So,
let me ask you a question. We're kind of venturing into a broader discussion about the election. And
Does this mean we can get off the subject now?
we can get off the subject, which you've all decided is there's not going to be a foreign policy election, and talk a little bit. I don't know about your conversations with leaders of the Republican Party, but my conversations with leaders of the establishment Republican Party is the palpable concern they have, mostly focused on Trump at this point, but you also see it in terms of their concern about Cruz. Is this just noise at this point, and they'll coalesce around whoever the nominee is because that's what you do after the primaries? Or is this a potentially fundamental problem for the Republicans if either of those two men become the nominee?
Well, just yesterday was a fascinating day. You saw Bob Dole and Trent Lott come out with a negative endorsement of Ted Cruz, basically anybody but Ted Cruz. On the same day, the National Review last night came out with an issue, a symposium they called it, with 30 leading conservatives and many establishment conservatives ranging from Bill Kristol to Brent Bozell with a negative endorsement about Donald Trump. So now the real core of establishment Republicans and many even base conservative leaders are split and have said, well, no to Donald Trump and no to Ted Cruz. And that was just yesterday.
But I would argue the establishment is no to either one of them. But each one has, I mean, different people have pet peeves, but this idea that the establishment is embracing Donald Trump or reconciling themselves, I think that's the biggest bunch of garbage I ever. I mean, the thing about it is,
Don't hold any punches,
they
Charlie.
see this guy as a stone loser in a general election if he were to get the nomination, and that would be a bad thing. But they personally despise Ted Cruz. And that for Bob Dole, God bless him, Cruz led the fight effectively to torpedo the disabilities treaty. And for Bob Dole felt humiliated by what they did. He went on the Senate floor and holds Ted Cruz personally responsible. So this is just personal. Now, they hate both of them, or they hate Trump, they hate Cruz, and they have no use for Donald Trump, but they're not embracing anybody. It's just who ticks you off more, Trump or Cruz, and different people come down different places. But the establishment is not going to, they're not going to be embracing Donald Trump.
But isn't that the problem for the establishment if they, at some point, they also haven't rallied around any other candidates? They remain split. It creates a really complicated few
And
months
it seems
ahead
to
of
me
us.
at the root of their fear is that they could not only lose the White House when they think they have a chance to win it, but that they could lose control of at least one house of Congress in the process. Now, Charlie, you wrote a piece just this week arguing that even, if I get it right, that if you look at all the toss-up seats, basically the Republicans can't lose the House unless something momentous happens.
Donald Trump could not even lose Republicans their majority in the House.
Yeah.
That with where these lines are, that cannot happen.
How about the Senate?
Oh, Senate. Republicans could lose the majority in the Senate just having a bad night.
Yeah.
I mean, they could have just an okay nominee and lose. I mean, because this is, when you've got 6 Republican seats up in states that Obama carried and only one, and no Democratic seats up in Romney states. I mean, this is just the arithmetic's bad for him. But, the way I see this things playing out is, I mean, Donald Trump has basically 35% of the vote. Now, 35% in a 12-way field, that's a big number. But when 12 goes to 8, goes to 6, goes to 4, goes to 3, goes to 2, I don't think that 35 number expands a whole lot. And I can see us coming down to a point where Trump will have a third, but probably bleeding a little bit. Cruz has a third, maybe. An establishment guy has a quarter. And then there's a fifth that's just up in the air. And what they do before, at the convention, I don't know.
Well, that leads to my next question, and then we're going to go to the audience. But I mean, when do you think we will have some better sense of who the Republican and the Democratic nominees are? If you put on your prognostication hats here, is it March 1st? Is it March 15th? Do we have to go into April and May? Do we go to the conventions? I mean, anybody?
The Democrat side's easier. If Bernie Sanders has a good day in Iowa and a good day in New Hampshire, South Carolina becomes a really interesting test, particularly with how Bernie Sanders can do among African Americans, which are going to be very important 2 weeks later on the March 1st Southern primaries. If he has a good day in Iowa and a good day in New Hampshire and a very bad day in South Carolina, that's going to tell you that the Democratic nomination could be wrapped up quickly for Hillary. If he has a good day in South Carolina, it goes on, I think, for quite a while. The Republican side, much more complicated. We have proportional voting through March 8th, March 15th. We begin, some of the states, not all of them, are winner take all, and that process really just keeps on going for a long time, because I think it could easily be May or June.
Let me take the Democratic side. Let's say, give Bernie Sanders, well, what are caucuses about? It's about ideology, passion, energy, okay? So let's give Bernie Sanders, just for fun, give him the Iowa caucus. In fact, let's give him all 15 states that have caucuses. Let's give him 100% of all the caucus state delegates, just for grins. And then let's give him New Hampshire and all of New England, 100% of all the delegates from New England. You know what that gets him? 36% of the delegates you need to win a convention, okay? After caucuses, New England, and college towns, Bernie Sanders has nothing going on. I mean, there are just not enough soy latte drinking, Birkenstock wearing, Subaru and Volvo driving people in the Democratic Party to nominate Bernie Sanders. And if God told me today that Hillary Clinton is not going to be the Democratic nominee for president, my assumption would be that the public integrity section moved, she was prosecuted, and Democrats are going to hit the red box on the ball, pull in case of fire, break the glass, and Joe Biden's phone number's inside. I mean, that's, but this nomination is not going to Bernie Sanders.
So wait, you just said the same thing I said.
Yes.
I said, look at
But I said it better than you did.
I said, look at South Carolina.
Look, it's now time to have it be said better by our members here. So I would like to turn this over, and if you could speak up, identify yourself, make it a question, even if it's a comment, turn it into a question. Keep it short, and we'll try to get it around to all of you. Oh, so back here in the back, yeah.
Jeff Bialis. Just as an aside, there's a sign on Pennsylvania Avenue where Trump is building a hotel, and it says "Trump coming in 2016." Maybe that's a harbinger of what's to come. And just one other quick aside, which is your comment on painting corners. I guess I just wonder how a party wins an election when they're against the trend on most major social issues in the country. But putting that to aside, my question, one is on immigration, which is you haven't mentioned really. And isn't this a periodic tendency of the nativist impulse sort of combined with a security element that we haven't seen before? Isn't that really a blend? Because the people who care about this care about immigration. It's sort of a foreign policy, international issue, but they care about it because they're afraid of their jobs and all of that. And Trump appeals to that blue collar guy. Some Democrats, by the way, which I worry about a little bit as I'm being on that side of the aisle. Second is, who are the foreign policy advisors to Donald Trump? Can you name them? I've asked people that and don't know it. And last question is turnout. Sorry, I saw a CNN poll and it had this incredible flip, and it showed. Last night, it showed that if you looked at people who are likely caucus goers, Sanders is way up. But if you looked at the people who came to the caucus last time, Clinton's considerably up. And I really wonder if the turnout numbers on a Sanders, and these people haven't sat through a 5-hour caucus, I have, are real, and maybe you can comment on that.
So let me address those poll numbers first.
CNN.
So new Iowa poll that CNN released yesterday. Among likely caucus goers, we screen for people that, as best we can, try to figure out who at least says they're going to caucus. Trump 37, Cruz 36, Rubio 14. So these are people who are likely caucus goers. If you actually look at who voted in the 2012 caucuses, remember Trump 37, Cruz 26. It flips. Cruz 30, Trump 28. So the answer to the question of who's going to win the Iowa caucuses is turnout. We always say turnout, but this year it's really Are there new caucus goers coming out, people who have not caucused before? Is there something in the Trump effect? And the exact same thing happens on the Democratic side in Iowa right now among likely caucus goers. Sanders 51, Clinton 43. But if you look at the 2008 caucus goers, the last time we had a competitive caucus in Iowa, it's flipped. Clinton 55, Sanders 38. So you are right, and we have absolutely no idea who's going to win the Iowa caucuses right now because we don't know who's going to turn out. If the weather is bad, that's going to change some things.
Can I
mean,
just
it's one of
emphasize
those.
that, having lived in Iowa and participated in the caucuses, ambient air temperature matters a lot because you have to decide whether you want to get off your sofa, go out in the minus 15-degree weather, go down to the local bus depot or fire department to kibitz with your neighbors or not. Colder it is, the more likely you're going to sit home and watch TV.
Especially older voters, it affects them even more than
I
younger
would say
voters.
even younger voters. So.
Well, the obvious problematic thing about looking at who voted in 2008, that's fine. It probably is that's probably a better indicator on the Republican side than a Democrat because Sanders' vote is so age-driven. If you're going to automatically exclude everybody that's under 26 years of age, which you would do if you were saying only people who caucused in 2008, then obviously that changes things. That changes things a great deal.
What about immigration as an issue? How do you see it playing out?
Well, so just to your question about how can Americans support someone who disagrees with them on social issues. Among Republicans, here are the numbers on what are the top issues. And terrorism is likely baked into the foreign policy question, but nevertheless, among likely primary voters in New Hampshire, foreign policy, 34%, jobs in the economy, 26%, immigration, 11%, and then it drops off a cliff. Healthcare, 4%, budget, national debt, 3%, social issues, 1%, among Republicans, taxes and education after that. It's just not it's not part of the conversation, it's not part of the campaign, it may be part of the general election, maybe, but it just doesn't seem to be registering right now.
Right here, in the front.
Hi. Since
Could
you've
you identify yourself?
yeah, Mark Kimmett. Since you sort of dismissed national security as an issue within the general or foreign policy in general,
Reduced it.
reduced it. How important is the issue of foreign policy writ national security going to differentiate on the nomination of the Republican candidate?
I think it matters much more, as we said, on the Republican side. I think clearly Trump has tapped into something that's important that has distinguished him from his establishment candidates. But I think it's less about the issues and more about the person. And I go back to the strong leader measurement, that foreign policy is one of those issues that allows you to establish via either your positions or your rhetoric yourself as a particularly strong leader, perhaps an electable leader. Ronald Reagan did this even in 1980 when it wasn't necessarily a foreign policy election. We had the hostages and whatnot. But Ronald Reagan used his foreign policy positions, talked about his strength, America's strength, and I think that built him up as a leader that, in a way that transcends foreign policy. He used those issues. Hillary Clinton is, even though foreign policy is not a top issue among Democrats, she's certainly using that as an electability factor against Bernie Sanders, asking the question about whether he should be the commander-in-chief, and using the strong leader metric again, not necessarily because Democrats are going to vote on foreign policy issues, but I think because Americans still prefer the stronger leader when they have a chance to choose.
I think this goes to the larger whole Trump phenomena. To me, a half of the Republican Party right now, angry isn't the word, they're livid. I mean, they're just filled with rage, and they're venting their spleens. And a lot of them are using Trump as a vehicle for this anger. Now, the question is this going to continue on through the convention? Or at some point will some sizable part of these Trump folks start to think, okay, I'm angry, I'm still angry, but seek a more plausible vehicle for their anger. And when I watch tapes of focus groups of Trump supporters, And you get them. I mean, they want you to know how angry they are, and they're not finished sending a message. But after about a half an hour of them talking, you start seeing some hairline fractures appearing, and you'll hear this: "I love what Trump says, but I wonder about his temperament," or "but I worry about his judgment," or "but I worry about his personality," and I think February is probably the last, I think my theory is February is the last month that people are going to be sending a message. And when the real stuff starts on March 1st, I think you're going to see a substantial part of this say, you know what, I'm having a hard time visualizing Donald Trump in the Situation Room, flanked by the Joint Chiefs, the Director of National Intelligence, Secretary of Defense and State, with his finger on the button. Now, I'm not saying all of the Trump people are going to bail out on him, but I think enough they're going to steer towards a alternative vehicle for their rage, and I suspect that's going to be Ted Cruz. So that I think you're going to see Cruz, he will have already, after Iowa, he will consolidate Huckabee, Santorum, Rand Paul will be no more. That Cruz will have completely consolidated the ideological conservative, but the question is this populist area that Trump's got. I think you're going to start seeing a decent number of those people bleeding over when they finish delivering their message and start selecting a president.
Just on that question, foreign policy isn't differentiating much among the Republican candidates. If you sort of look at it, in essence, for Rand Paul, he's sort of out of tune with where the Republicans are. But Lindsey Graham is sort of the one, and in the sense with it has the most specific and, quote, tough program. I mean, he was willing to send tens of thousands of troops to Syria, and he's now on the sidelines. I think most of the candidates in the Republican race that are still there are angry. They're going to do something. It's attitude. It's not a specific policy. What really strikes me, though, is the sort of reverse question, which is why hasn't foreign policy or concern about terrorism differentiated among Republican candidates? Why hasn't it been that Republican candidates with more experience have come to the forefront and someone like Donald Trump fallen to the wayside, just for the reasons that Charlie just laid out? And what's really interesting looking at the polls, and I think Bruce and Charlie know this really well, is when you ask Republican voters what characteristics are you looking for in a candidate, experience ranks way down at the bottom. They're not interested in people who have experience, and that's why you look at all the governors who came into the race, and typically governors have very strong chances to become the nominee. They've gone by the wayside. No Governor Walker, no Governor Jindal, and the governors we do have still in the race are at the back of the pack.
Three-term governor of Texas, Governor Perry, was the first one out.
We've seen, I mean, in the Republican Party, experience and expertise is now a disqualifying characteristic with half of the Republican Party. Go figure.
But this also gets us back to the question you asked.
It's so overrated.
But you asked about the establishment before, and the question is not what the establishment thinks, but does the establishment matter for how the election is going to play out?
Yeah. Okay, right here in front.
Lloyd Hand. I have a sort of a two-part question. First one, I don't think you know the answer, but I'd be very interested in your, based on everything you've read and you've heard, what your current analysis assessment is, and that is when and what do you think Director Comey is going to come out with? Secondly, incidentally, I think it's a wonderful discussion, very entertaining and illuminating. Second question is, who do you think ultimately will emerge as the so-called establishment candidate?
Any thoughts?
The answer to the first question, I have absolutely no idea what Director Comey may be doing. We'll see. He keeps his cards very close to his vest. He's a good FBI director in that way. The polls are suggesting that if there's coalescing going on, it seems to be Rubio, but I think we're also looking at polls in 2 states right now, and that's what matters, because if the establishment candidate, if someone other than Rubio or whoever perhaps the third place candidate or the establishment candidate, maybe even the second place candidate in New Hampshire could find themselves with a little bit of momentum, I think it's a little hard to tell. I mean, we're at the edge of double digits. on the establishment candidate, particularly in New Hampshire, which is where it matters. Rubio seems to have an edge consistently in more states than anybody else, but I wouldn't be surprised if there were a surprise, particularly in New Hampshire. So I think the jury really is going to be out on that until February.
But what does
go
this,
back to the-
yeah, but what does this say about the fact that there is a consensus, I think, among the commentariat, that Rubio may emerge as the establishment candidate? This is a guy who ran as the Tea Party candidate when he first ran for the Senate and would be considered 3 or 4 years ago to be the right wing of the Republican Party. So
We're
what does
talking
this say
about a former Speaker of the Florida House. Now, admittedly, it was a term limit state, so that's
Yeah.
who runs as a Tea Party guy in 2010 because that was the avenue to the Republican nomination
That was the
in a
energy
Senate
in
seat.
2010 was
Yeah,
through the
yeah,
Tea Party.
yeah. And then ever since, he's been an establishment guy, although in the last 4 or 5 weeks, he's started throwing more red meat into his rhetoric, but he had to do that. But I don't think Rubio is a Tea Party guy at all. But to Lloyd's other question, this is one of the classic, anybody who's talking doesn't know anybody that knows isn't talking. But it strikes me that this email thing is a hot potato that the FBI will want to get out of their hands. And so they'll package it all up, hand it to public integrity section, and say, that's why they pay you guys the big money. And I personally think that the most important primary or caucus for Democrats is the one at 1400 New York Avenue, which is where the public integrity section has their offices. And Lord knows what they're going to do. I don't know. But to me, that's the only key variable for the Democratic nomination is what do they do? And I've had lots of conversations with various people and, lots of theories. And it almost seems like someone's proximity to classified material makes them more likely to think that this thing may go to a bad place for Secretary Clinton than people with less. But, it's clearly not anything like the Petraeus situation. It's clearly not anything like what happened to the late Sandy Berger. This is more getting into John Deutsch territory, and
Okay, in the back, way in the back.
Thank you. My name is Igor Dunevsky. I'm a reporter for Russian newspaper. So my question is, do you think that the issue of policy and the U.S.-Russia relations can be, what role can it play in current campaign, especially maybe it become more important to the second half of campaign if ex-Secretary Clinton becomes a nominee, because she was sort of author of the Reset with Russia, and Republicans consider that it didn't came well, so it's maybe a subject to attack her. And secondly, to what degree do you think the current statements of candidates on Russia might reflect their policy if they come to White House? For example, Senator Rubio on multiple occasions called Russian President Putin as a gangster, and as bad as Russia-American relations were during the last 2 years, our presidents still weren't at the point when they called each other a gangster. So if he comes to the White House, will he keep the line? Thank you.
On the other hand, Trump has praised Putin. So, how do you think this is all going to play out?
I agree with what Jim had said earlier about where foreign policy issues play in the campaign. If it's not terrorism related directly, I don't think there are going to be many Americans who are voting on it, and if Americans aren't voting on it, I don't think it's going to be a big issue. I think Putin becomes an interesting foil for candidates, for candidates to demonstrate perhaps their toughness or how they might interact with a foreign leader. But I don't think the issue of Russia, or frankly, the issue of U.S. relations with almost any country is going to be a significant factor in voting.
But let me ask you all a hypothetical. Obviously, we can dream up all sorts of hypotheticals that shift the nature of this debate. But let's say, just for instance, that the Russians would decide to do something more in Ukraine or do something in the Baltics. In other words, demonstrate that this hasn't calmed down but has actually gotten worse. would that even rise to the level of attention other than just rhetorical excess by candidates, or I mean, would it become an issue?
Well, or should it be considered an in-kind contribution to the Republican Party?
Right. Yeah. The FEC might have to
That's what
figure
I'd
out how
say
to
is,
judge
you
that.
want to guarantee any Republican wins, that's what it would take. That'd do it.
But it would have to be such a significant move that Americans felt it as a direct threat to the United States. And even what you described, I'm not sure, unless it touched terrorism again or terrorism at home, I'm not even sure that would do it.
It'll shape what the candidates talk about, and they will all, in essence, be backward-looking, saying, if I had been president, this wouldn't have happened, because I'm strong, and Mr. Putin would have respected that.
Right.
It's not going to lead to any sort of great policy pronouncements. I don't think it's going to move what the public thinks. Specifically, and I think it does create a problem potentially for Secretary Clinton, because she is identified with the reset, so it gives the Republican candidate in a general election, if Secretary Clinton is the candidate, with a talking point as why you can't trust her experience because she didn't do a good job with that experience. That'll be the Republican argument on the reset.
Okay, right here.
Charlie, Rob Cortell. So this is for you. Very simple question. Based on the numbers.
Sam, be prepared to bail
and
me
the-
out here.
And the tactics, could Trump beat Clinton?
You know, I love polls, and I, at least the good ones, I tend to live and die by them. But there's sometimes when you look at polling and you just wonder, how seriously should I take this? And for example, and I'll get to your question, but for example, we're seeing polling right now that shows Bernie Sanders running stronger than Hillary Clinton against various Republicans.
Including Donald Trump.
Including Donald Trump. And it's a product of Clinton's numbers are so bad among independents, and that they have heard virtually anything ugly you could ever say about Hillary Clinton. And Bernie Sanders, I think independents are less, they're following Bernie a lot less than Democrats are. And, you know, my guess is his negatives will go up. But are they going to go up to, I think in the last NBC Wall Street Journal poll, among independents, Hillary Clinton's negatives were like 57, 59%, something like that. I mean, it was a big number. Are they going to rise that high? And so I don't know how seriously to take things when people know lots about one thing, not as much about something else, and where the Trump, you know, their attitudes towards Donald Trump may not be quite as developed now as they will be, you know, down the road. So the short answer is I think Republicans may do something stupid, but they're not going to do something insane in this election. And I just don't think they're going there. I really
At the same time, I'd like to see a show of hands of anybody in this room, very smart, mostly Washingtonians, who believed a year ago that Donald Trump would be the front runner for the Republican nomination. Go ahead, raise your hands.
I would note to the audience watching that there are no hands have been raised. But
Because that shows how much we know.
Let me just follow up on, I mean, bearing in mind Charlie's point, he doesn't think Trump's going to be the nominee. But I have talked to two union leaders, and again, bear in mind that unions only represent 9% of the private workforce, so they're a small, number of people. But two union leaders in two very prominent unions, when asked about how do their members feel about Trump, and in both cases, our guys love him. So the question is, how many Trump Democrats are there out there for a general election if, in fact, Trump would get to the general election?
Well, I guess I would ask is, working class white voters, how many of them are voting Democratic now anyway?
Yeah.
And I think the short answer is not much.
Even union members.
Yeah, even union.
Even union members.
Yeah.
And if it was building and construction trades least of all, manufacturing would be in second place, public employees, now they probably stay.
But now just take that limited number and only look at Ohio and maybe Pennsylvania.
battleground states where it's
If
gonna
you look at Ohio and Pennsylvania, where there is a lot of white union manufacturing and a lot of white non-union manufacturing going on. And the Trump phenomenon in Ohio, I have absolutely no idea how that could play out, but that's the place I would want to see it. I'd want to learn more.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, Doug.
Thanks. Doug Paul. I wanted to sort of fight the trend that you guys are putting out about foreign policy not playing a role. August 14, when the two Americans were beheaded in Iraq, public opinion polls really changed a lot about staying engaged in the world. And then in your December debate, Wolf Blitzer just asked one question after another about terrorism. It was all about terrorism.
It was 100%.
It was
foreign
just,
policy.
and I kind of wonder what's the economy going to look like under this sort of circumstance. Now, my question is, does ISIS get a vote this primary season? Can they do something that will make a difference like it did in August of 14?
Good question.
Well, this is always the perennial question whether you're going to get an October surprise
Right.
that upsets it. And again, it's another sort of white whale. We keep talking about maybe this will be the election, it will happen, and it hasn't happened. What I will note, if you go back to August of 2014 with the beheadings, that what it did was it changed the conversation. I'm not sure it necessarily changed who the candidates were going to be, or that it's going to have an impact on what the outcome of the vote will be. And I think we tend to sort of focus on what the public is thinking, but there's a whole bunch of steps between what the public thinks or is talking about and what voting outcomes are. And I think that's important to keep in mind during this whole conversation. So yes, you could have a surprise. I think Charlie, quite wisely at the beginning, put a big caveat in that given where we are right now and what trends are right now, foreign policy won't be the dominant issue, but it could change.
Go ahead.
August 2014 is when America was introduced to ISIS. America had never heard of ISIS. Maybe a few of us had heard of ISIS and realized there's a growing issue out there, but America didn't know what ISIS was, and it wasn't it was barely in the newspapers at all. It was not something that Americans were talking about. Okay, now 2 years later, or it'll be 2 years later before the election, America knows what ISIS is. The question then is, at this point, what can ISIS do to really shock America? But that could be the October surprise.
And I would imagine if you're a candidate, particularly in your scenario, Doug, it would benefit Republicans given where public opinion is. The challenge to the Democratic nominee is to take steps over the course of the summer into the fall to inoculate yourself against that happening by staking out the argument that I am tough too, and I am tough and sensible, and presumably what a Democratic candidate will say is my opponent is tough and reckless, or forget the tough, just simply reckless.
And equally unpredictable, where's the economy going to be? And could there be an economic October surprise as we saw in 2008? Another factor that the candidates can't campaign, but it's an external force that will drive a lot of voters.
I've made one note during this conversation. FP, foreign policy, white whale, Jim. Okay. To me, that's the money line.
You're not calling Jim a white whale.
No. I'm more the, but that's where I'm going to be getting a proper quote from you.
I just finished reading Moby Dick. So
and using, but you know, it's sort of foreign policy and elections. It's kind of like the economy in Wall Street. This time's different. And how many times do we hear this time's different? And in the end, how often is it really different? And it can occasionally, but not often. And I think if you knew absolutely nothing about anything going on, you're better off betting that history will play out more than this will be different from all the time. Now, obviously, this election, as Sam said, nobody a year ago saw Donald Trump coming, absolutely. Nobody thought he was coming. Nobody thought he'd go this high. Nobody thought he'd stay this high, yada, yada, yada. That is all absolutely true. But I think at the end of the day, will those of us who watch politics very, very, very closely, will everything that we have ever learned about politics be proven wrong this year? Everything, 100%. I'm going to kind of bet the against. This will be a different year. It's a weird year. It's going to have some unusual dynamics. But for Donald Trump to win this thing would require 100% of everything we knew at the beginning, to be wrong.
On that note, which I think is a fairly conclusive note, we're going to end this. I want to thank all the members. I want to thank the folks who've been watching this via the live streaming. And we look forward to carrying on this conversation and talking about the President Trump's foreign policy in 2017 or Bernie Sanders' foreign policy in 2017. So thank you very much.
Thank you.